Well, I was with Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday at the State Department at an event, and I was asking him about what he expects in terms of details in this process, in this conversation today, whether he expects Ukraine to surrender lands it currently controls, whether he expects the boundaries of an ultimate settlement, if there is one, to be frozen along the front line of the war. And what he said is that this is an important first opportunity for President Trump to look President Putin in the eye and figure out what is possible in terms of a negotiation and an outcome. So more than being focused on particular details coming into this conversation, being focused on trying to set the groundwork and lay the groundwork for a process. President Trump has said this could even continue as soon as next week, adding President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. But of course, ultimately, U.S. officials understand that any final and any potential negotiation to end this war would need to be between Russia and Ukraine.
Eric, one thing I want to ask you is, and we all kind of like perked up because this was anticipated to be a one-on-one meeting and then it became a 3-on-3 format. So when you were talking with the Secretary of State yesterday, was there any indication that things were kind of loose and were evolving as we go?
Well, Carol, one thing that he mentioned was that this has been put together incredibly fast. It's been basically 8 or 9 days since we first learned that there would be a summit. And so a lot of work necessary going into the logistics, getting the famous presidential limo, armored limo, the Beast armored SUV to Anchorage. And we actually just saw a few moments ago President Trump and President Putin together, just the two of them in the Beast. So there was, and without interpreters, so there was certainly an opportunity for the two of them to have at least a few minutes together on their way to the meeting site. They've just had the camera spray at the top of the meeting with the press shouting any number of questions at President Putin, which is something he's certainly not accustomed to at home in Moscow. And we're now seeing this meeting beginning, but certainly there are a lot of members of delegation from both sides. We know Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, two important from the economic and financial side from Washington. And we're settling in for a process that depends on who you ask. The White House had estimated about maybe 3 hours for this process. The Kremlin, through Interfax news agency, signaling that they see this going as long as 6 or 7 hours, this meeting. So everyone is really preparing for a potentially long night, especially when you account for the time difference between us here in Washington and 4 hours earlier in Anchorage.
It's interesting, Derek, how quickly things seem to be changing. You know, Carol mentioned the one-on-one to now the 3-on-1. You mentioned, them going in this limo. It's not clear whether that was planned or not. I'm wondering if, just from your conversations with U.S. officials, that is kind of by design, that this meeting was almost supposed to be, things changing on the fly. Is that kind of Trump's style here in negotiations like this?
Well, that's not something that we picked up in terms of the strategy, but we do know that Trump is a president who is very open to kind of acting in the moment and doing what he feels is right in the moment. We know that he is very talkative, certainly with the press, in terms of answering questions, often in a surprising way, based on whatever is in the news and whatever is asked of him. I still remember Inauguration Day, where he sat down at the Resolute desk and held forth for 45 minutes, taking every manner of question from the press, which had not been something typically seen in such an informal setting from President Joe Biden, his predecessor. So certainly there's a degree of, let's say, flexibility from this president. Even just deciding to sit down with President Putin was a somewhat unexpected gesture, somewhat unexpected step, but we've seen him in the past willing to do so, sitting down with President Kim Jong-un of North Korea famously during the first administration. And so in one way surprising, but in another way entirely not, that we find these two leaders together for this historic summit, the first visit of the Russian president to the U.S. in 10 years.
We're talking with Eric Martin, Bloomberg News State Department and Foreign Policy reporter. He's there in our Washington, D.C. bureau. We're talking too about how it was, a very stage managed opening. Our own Derek Wallbank out with a story on the Bloomberg about this, a warm handshake on the tarmac, a military overfly. And then, as Derek writes, who we talked to earlier here live on our show, things veered off script. And that is, as Eric also pointed out, President Putin and President Trump slipping into the beast, the presidential limo, President Trump's presidential limo. And that's where they were one-on-one. There was no one else out of earshot of their aides. And that ride to Joint Base, or I should say the short ride from the tarmac to the summit room at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, that's the U.S. military official facility where the meetings will take place. That was about less than 10 minutes of a ride, but it did give both leaders a chance to, again, have a very private conversation ahead of their meetings with some of their senior key aides on the ground. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. And, Eric, I think about first and foremost, and I think it's safe to say that, right, first and foremost on the mind of President Trump is to bring an end to this war. He's been very vocal about that, upset about the loss of lives on both sides, but certainly upset when he seemed to have seen or maybe had a conversation with President Putin and to see continued fire into Ukraine and, again, the loss of lives. So this is front and center. This is what's top of mind for him to bring some kind of end to this war.
Well, certainly ceasefire is an initial first step. It's something that Secretary Rubio told me yesterday as a first step towards having a larger conversation about territorial boundaries, about security guarantees for Ukraine, and in terms of U.S. partners and allies in NATO as well. Of course, this is also for President Trump. We are 7 months almost into his administration. And this is an unkept campaign promise in a way, right? He talked about when he was a candidate that he was going to bring this war to a close either before taking office or on his first day in office. We've just reached 200 days, and that has not yet happened. So this is a big unkept promise in a way. One certainly one could argue out of his control, but one that he made, and therefore something that he is eager to see through to fruition.